Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and you're listening to Bartley's Commentaries on the Cosmic Wars. In this segment, I'm going to talk about the so-called war against the cartels. I'm going to provide some background information showing that the forces they will be arrayed against, I'm talking about the American military forces, are deeply entrenched, are actually more powerful than they are from the standpoint of backing from the government itself that they're presumably fighting for, deep black elements therein, as well as powerful forces abroad. And I'm going to go into details about this. It makes for interesting reading. If you've taken the time to read about the drug trafficking out of Southeast Asia, the drug trafficking leading up to Iran-Contra, the CIA-Contra drug war, the trafficking out of Panama, Colombia, Honduras, all under CIA control. And now we have all these cheerleaders all having a hallelujah breakdown because the military is going to be turned loose on the cartels. Just makes my head spin at the ludicrousness of it all. You just look at the recently concluded bogus war on terror. The terrorists have taken over Afghanistan. It was actually given to them. Then it turned out that the Taliban were being funded millions and millions of dollars. It was bad enough they left all this brand new equipment for the Taliban, and now hordes of terrorists are being brought in lock, stock, and barrel into the West. So great job, U.S. military, British military, the Danes, all of you that took part in the failed war on terror. And look what you've done to Syria. Now, Christians, Alawites, anyone who's not an Islamist is being raped, tortured, murdered, and we can thank Joint Special Operations Command for that. We can thank the Air Force. We can thank all the mercenaries who were hired by the federal government and the British government for turning Syria over to a bunch of jihadists. Well, why not? They've been supporting them all this time anyway. It was bad enough they turned over Libya to the jihadists, and for some time now they've been having open-air slave markets there. And then, of course, what they did to Iraq, they've just made it legal to marry 9-year-old girls there. Thank you, all you warriors for the West, protecting us from the terrorists. Thank you for that. And for finding all the weapons of mass destruction. We all know how that went. And, of course, lock, stock, and barrel, all these jihadists are being sent to the West. And what was the war on terror all about anyway? What was the justification for that? What were some of the excuses? We'd rather fight them there than have them come over here. Well, they're over here now, and now we're going to go into this cartel war against cartels that have been armed, supplied, trained by the CIA, Mossad, other forces for a long time, been protected by the Justice Department, protected by the DEA, even though elements within the DEA want to go after these guys. They're always going to run into roadblocks. They're always going to run into interference. Some of the DEA operatives that want to go after these major drug kingpins get harassed, messed with, etc., etc. And now these flag wavers, the same ones who thought they'd protect us from terrorists, are now going to be sent in after the cartels. The absurdity of it all just makes my head spin. This will spill into the CONUS, the continental U.S., because there's going to be gunfights, gun battles in the border cities like Ciudad de Juarez, Tijuana, places like that. They may not want to, but that's what's going to happen. And they may even try to cover that up, come up with cover stories, whatever the case may be. But it's going to go from the border cities and towns into the interior of the country. One thing that these flag wavers don't understand is the depths of depravity when you're dealing with these hardcore drug kingpins, narco terrorists, drug lords, cartels, call them what you will. This tradition this institutionalized tradition hardwired into their DNA of depravity, of sadism, of cruelty, goes clear back centuries. Where do you think the Mayas and the Aztecs got some of their ideas from? Some of these major drug lords in South America and Central America, they're hardcore practitioners, some of them, of black magic and very, very dark arts. What happened in the border town of Matamoros, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, this is right across from Brownsville. That was pretty much my old stomping grounds when I was a young boy, because as a young boy, I lived in Corpus Christi, Texas, also spent time in Brownsville and other places because my dad at the time was stationed at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi and also Naval Air Station, later Naval Air Facility, Kingsville. So I did a lot of fishing, crabbing in the Gulf of Mexico, and this is how I became a Dallas Cowboy fan. That was my connection initially. If you remember the story about Mark Kilroy, he was out partying with some friends. He crossed over from Brownsville into Matamoros. This is something that Americans do constantly. They cross over from America into Mexico. And the horror stories I've heard, Americans, especially American women, young women, crossing over from California into Tijuana and the trouble they get into over there. Jeez Louise. But Mark Kilroy was a good kid. He went with a few of his friends to Matamoros. He just wanted to have a few drinks, party. And long story short, he gets kidnapped by a satanic cult that was also a drug running cult. And Mark Kilroy was tortured and murdered. And he was buried. And when the authorities arrested the cult members, they found a mass grave. And apparently one of the bodies they dug up was Mark Kilroy's. Point of relevance is that level of depravity is not unusual when it comes to some of these Latin Americans. Think about the death squads in virtually every Central and South American country worth speaking of. These death squads were trained by Argentinians, by Americans, by Israelis, and foreign mercenaries. And they would go around and they would rape and murder and wipe out a large number of people. They were also connected at some levels with the World Anti-Communist League, the depraved, sick sewer scum in that organization would torture children in front of their parents, torture them to death. It's one thing to hate and despise communists, which I can understand, but to delve deep into that level of depravity and evil, to torture and murder and mutilate, which was the norm for these death squads, these so-called right-wing death squads, supported by the U.S. and also the World Anti-Communist League, staffed by psychopaths from throughout the world, many of them former fascists, former quote-unquote fascists/Nazis. And they went around torturing people, killing them in the name of fighting communism. So this whole concept of depravity, of murder, of mutilations, of torture is well embedded in Latin America. That's what they do. We're talking about psychopaths who are not even Satanists. And then when you get to that level, like I just spoke about, of Matamoros, and what happened in Matamoros probably is minor compared to what happens in other parts of Latin America. We're talking about depravity on a cosmic scale, basically. These people use the term people very loosely here. They are vengeful. They are into vendettas. And if they've got the support of the deep black state, the deep state, the CIA, the elements of the Justice Department, this notion that Trump's going to come in and everything's just going to change, suddenly there's not going to be any more state-sponsored drug trafficking, suddenly there's not going to be any more CIA drug trafficking. This level of naivete, and I mean, it's got to stop. It really has to. Because all these people in the military are doing are advancing, furthering the New World Order agenda. And they're just happy to get to go shoot people, kill people, and blow things up. They're happy about that. But they don't see the consequences, like what's happening right now in Syria. Thousands and thousands, upwards of 20,000 Christians and Alawites and others that are non-Islamist are getting tortured, beheaded, stoned, buried alive, decapitated. And who put them in there? Who made it possible for them to get in there and do their dirty work? Well, the West did, of course. Just look at who Trump was shaking hands with. Jelani, the jihadist that was installed by the U.S., NATO, and the Israelis. That guy has so much blood in his hands, decapitating, mutilating, murdering. And here's Trump saying what a handsome guy he is and hobnobbing with him along with the Saudis. Just disgusting if you ask me. This is what might happen. I don't want it to happen, but the possibility exists. We've seen this in the past when legitimate, patriotic DEA agents are trying to shut down or arrest these big-time narco traffickers. They get harassed. They get threatened with imprisonment. Look what happened to Michael Levine. Look what happened to Celerino Castillo. They just get harassed. These are brave, brave Americans who are fighting against the cartels. And then the Justice Department goes after them because these are so-called protected CIA intelligence assets. The biggest drug lords and biggest traffickers in the DEA database are always, underlined 3 times, always protected CIA intelligence assets, so-called. What happened in Honduras during the CIA-Contra drug war? Local DEA wanted to go after the biggest drug traffickers in Honduras. CIA intervened, and the DEA simply closed their DEA office in Honduras. That's how it works. Now, what may happen, I don't want this to happen, but what may happen is if some of you special forces guys get out of line and you develop your own intelligence networks, and that's a whole nother issue I haven't even delved into yet. I talked a bit about it with John Franklin, recent interview. Well, not my interview, but I had John Franklin on. And if you didn't hear part 2, and if you're a Milab, that's something you need to plug into. But we talked about the secret team, how CIA officers are embedded into the military. It may look from all outward appearances you are being briefed by an intelligence officer in the Green Berets and Special Forces. That may seem to all outward appearances to be a Green Beret colonel standing in front of you, or a Army or Air Force general standing in front of you, but they're really CIA intelligence officers. You got to read the book by the late great L. Fletcher Prouty. He was the focal point officer for the Air Force whenever the CIA needed logistical communications, air transport assistance in their covert operations worldwide, and they needed the Air Force's help. They went through L. Fletcher Prouty, the late great Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, who was also a UFO truther. Not many people know that, but he was. He was the real life model for the Donald Sutherland character in the movie JFK. And you've got to read his book, The Secret Team, because he goes into it's a thick book, like John Franklin was talking about in our interview, in his interview on my show. It's over 500 pages, and it's hard to get. But if you can find it, read it cover to cover, because he goes into detail. These CIA officers are embedded everywhere, in the military, in the FAA, in the Justice Department, in the financial sector, in the banking industry, etc., etc., etc. And if they get wind of some of you special forces guys, because you're getting tired of all your operations getting thwarted, Michael Levine and others talk about how whenever they're going to do a big bust, they raid the place, they raid the jungle factory, where cocaine is being processed and it's abandoned. Time after time after time, they go in to make a big raid and nobody's home. That's because they were tipped off. And I'm going to go into details. I'm going to read some of these from some of these books. The information you're going to get from me is not what you would get from an internet scroller. There's a difference between someone who's a serious student of history and someone who's just an internet scroller, pointer, clicker. If you call yourself a researcher, you should have available at hand several dozens of books about this, that, or the other subject. If you consider yourself a real, serious student of history, these books should just be on your bookshelf. And I'm going to talk about some of these books coming up that deal with the CIA drug trafficking and the military intelligence drug trafficking. So if there are enterprising special forces guys, let's say, who are sick and tired of dry holes, these raids, there's no one there, or they get the chance to bag some small fry, and say they decide to start their own intelligence networks. This is what the SEALs did in Vietnam, by the way. They got tired of being led around by the nose by the CIA, especially as it related to Project Phoenix, the Phoenix Project, which is a countrywide assassination torture program put together by the CIA. Long story, read Douglas Valentine's book about that subject. But what some SEAL teams did, and I'm sure some Green Beret teams did this too, especially those caught up in the Phoenix program, was some of the SEALs set up their own intelligence networks because they didn't want to rely any longer on the CIA because they were getting bad dope. They were getting bad intel. So fast forward to the present time. Let's say there's some special forces units that are tired of being given false information, tired of raiding places and no one's there, or tired of bagging small fry, even though they're told over and over, oh, these are high-value targets. Where have you heard that before? The war on terror. Everyone's a high-value target. And I'm sure they bagged and killed some very, very evil people that needed to be killed. But as far as the collateral damage, what's happening in Syria, Libya, and throughout the Mediterranean, North African littoral, rapidly spreading throughout Europe, throughout the West. Anyway, let's say some enterprising special forces types decide to set up their own intelligence networks and actually identify real kingpins, real drug lords, and they're going to go after them. Well, if the threat from the Justice Department isn't enough to make them back off, we're talking about arrest, being set up on drug charges, guess what? They're going to tip off the cartels. They're going to tell them where your family lives. They're going to tell them everything they need to know. Where your wife goes to work, where your children go to school. You don't think they're capable or willing to do that? You're living in la la land. Look what happened to Green Beret William Tyree. His wife was a member of the Army's Criminal Investigations Division, CID. And William Tyree, and his wife were amassing all this documentation about CIA, Army Special Forces drug trafficking in the early 1970s, early mid-1970s, Operation Watchtower, if memory serves. Special Forces teams infiltrated into Colombia, set up some beacons that would allow low-flying, drug-laden planes flying out of Colombia to pick up these beacons that would home them in to land in certain airfields in Panama. And these cargoes would be just drugs, just wall-to-wall drugs. Well, what did they do to William Tyree? They murdered his wife, cut her head off. Then they falsely accused him of doing it, and he wound up in a federal pen. I don't know if he's still alive, he'd still be in there. That's what I'm talking about. Look what happened to the Green Beret medic, Jeffrey McDonald. He and his family were chosen as victims of a satanic attack, basically. And the satanic group came in, killed his wife and children. He was blamed for it. Ted Gunderson investigated this case. And that satanic cult was involved in drug trafficking because the military, and this is in the Vietnam era, and the CIA were bringing in loads of drugs from the Golden Triangle, Southeast Asia. They had a system worked out whereby, this is well known, and a lot of you flag-waving special forces influencers still don't know this, and it's not surprising because you still think Osama bin Laden was responsible for 9/11. That's how lame you are. Drugs were being stuffed into the body cavities of dead American servicemen. At the shipping side of the house, they would put a special code in the paperwork for the body. So when the body would be shipped back to Dover Air Force Base or Travis Air Force Base, on the receiving end, somebody would see that code identifying, designating a particular cadaver, a particular body as having the drugs, heroin usually, stuffed inside of them. This is well known. I spoke to somebody who had flown with Air America during the Vietnam War, and he said that's what they did. He flew in transport planes that carried drug cargoes. So let me get back to Jeffrey McDonald and what happened to him. They framed Jeffrey McDonald, and then they throw him in a federal pen. And the ones who did it was a satanic cult involved in drug trafficking, and the drugs they were getting were brought in by the military. That's how deep this thing runs. So in our example, what may happen if you stray off the reservation and begin doing things your own way, setting up your own intel networks, they may tell the cartels everything they need to know about your family. During the Iran-Contra drug wars, one of the ways they got rid of a lot of lower and mid-level guys who they deemed to be untrustworthy or considered to have big mouths, they bumped them off, and the assassinations and murders were routinely blamed on, quote-unquote, Colombian hitmen, right? Colombian hitmen supposedly bumped off Barry Seal, longtime CIA operative, former Special Forces guy, pilot. He was part of the same Civil Air Patrol unit that trained with the likes of David Ferrie and Lee Harvey Oswald. I didn't get into it in the interview with John Franklin, but when John Franklin brought up Lee Harvey Oswald, that was a whole can of worms. I don't even want to go there because it would have taken too long. What most people don't know is that David Ferrie was something of a hypnotist. In fact, he spent a lot of his time hypnotizing people, especially the young boys, because he was a pedophile that he got involved with. And there's no doubt in my mind that he and others had hypnotized Lee Harvey Oswald. That was a whole nother can of worms. I didn't want that to detract from the main story of the drug trafficking and what the military is actually going to be going up against. But if you have a system set up whereby the powers that be, the Justice Department, the CIA, etc., they're actively going to tip off the cartels, your family, how to access the best places to kill them. You guys have no idea what you're getting yourselves into, and that's not even half of it. Because in this case, if you're going to war against the cartels, they may allow you to knock off some small fry every now and then just to make a big splash in the media, in the newspapers. But as far as knocking off the big boys, the mega traffickers, no. Because like I said in the John Franklin interview, everyone benefits. The deep state, the CIA, the banks, it makes their ledgers look a lot better when they're washing millions and millions of dollars of drug money through their banks. The deep state, the corporations, there's a lot of corporations deeply involved in drug trafficking, which I'll get into. They're not going to want that to go away because some flag wavers want it to go away. That's not how it works. So I can see a time, and I don't want it to happen, but I can see a time come when they may tip off the cartels, give them valuable intel about your personal information, about how to access and get to your families, because that's what they do. I talked about the depravity of some of these Latin Americans going back centuries now. Another thing you have to factor into is the tech savviness, if that's a word, of these cartels. The cartels were the ones that pioneered the use of the Nokia type generic phone and a whole bunch of SIM cards. Make a phone call, check the SIM card. Make another phone call, check the SIM card. Where did they get that idea from? Well, interesting. What's come out on the Redacted show in the recent past, and it's no surprise to me, turns out that the cartels have been supplied with software that allows them to track people through their digital devices. So the cartels won't even be reliant upon their handlers or their allies in the spook world. They can track down people quite easily on their own. Think about that. Here's one of the books I'm going to be reading from: Cocaine Politics, Drugs, Armies, and the CIA in Central America, written by Peter Dale Scott and Jonathan Marshall. And I've got a few other books I will read from also. There's a lot of books on the subject: The Bluegrass Conspiracy, of course, Gary Webb's classic, the late great Gary Webb's classic, Dark Alliance. I'll also reference Rodney Stitch's books, the various volumes of Defrauding America. Lots of key information in there about the spook world, the drug trafficking, the financial fraud, etc., etc. Also, Barry and the Boys, Daniel Hopsiger, great book, and Our Man in Panama by John Dingus about Manuel Noriega, Called to Serve, written by the legendary Green Beret Mike Force commander in Vietnam, Bo Greitz. So there's a lot of information to draw upon, but I'll only read from a few books just so you get the idea of what I'm talking about. This is Cocaine Politics, Drugs, Armies, and the CIA in Central America. Just in the preface, there's a very interesting point made here. For example, CIA aid for the Contras in Costa Rica was channeled chiefly through the tightly controlled Ilopango Air Base in El Salvador, a base where the real power is exercised by a U.S. colonel responsible for Contra support. The local DEA agent at the time, Celerino Castillo, has since charged that 2 hangars there, which were under CIA and Oliver North's control, doubled as depots for major cocaine shipments. Castillo claims that his documented reports on Ilopango to DEA in Washington were never acted on. A number of notorious drug traffickers are known to have regularly flown in and out of Ilopango. A drug plane given over the Contras and CIA was stationed there, and Ilopango allegedly served as a base for American drug networks such as the Notorious Company, which distributed drugs through the entire United States. Castillo was kept under wraps by the DEA during his service in Central America and was not called to testify before the Kerry Committee, which investigated links between the Contras, drugs, and the U.S. government in the 1980s. His first-hand account was published in Canada, but it has been almost entirely ignored by the U.S. media. No surprise there. Continuing, the Miami drug trial of former Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega, 1991, after this book went to press, also supplied intriguing new details about the Central American connection. Noriega was at one time also a Contra supporter. A little-known fact, he actually funneled arms to the El Salvadoran communist guerrillas. We always heard Reagan talking about, we got to stop what's going on with the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua because they're exporting revolution to El Salvador by providing arms to the Salvadoran rebels. Well, it was actually the CIA and military intelligence man in Panama, Manuel Noriega, who was doing that initially. Continuing, Noriega was at one time also a Contra supporter, and his initial drug indictment in 1988 was for shipments with pilots who were at the same time flying aid for Contra camps in Costa Rica. This potentially embarrassing charge was ultimately dropped. No surprise there. Some of the government's witnesses against Noriega provided more information than the show trial was scripted for. To quote from a 1991 Washington Post editorial, what is one to make of the riveting assertion made by a convicted Colombian drug kingpin at Manuel Noriega's Florida drug trial that the Medellin cartel gave $10 million to the Nicaraguan Contras? Carlos Later is a key prosecution witness. The U.S. government cannot lightly assail his credibility. Carlos Later was one of the kingpins of the Colombian drug cartel. The aforementioned Ilopango Air Base. If memory serves, Felix Rodriguez, this infamous CIA operative, Cuban-born CIA operative, he was the one that led the teams to hunt down Che Guevara in Bolivia. If memory serves, Felix Rodriguez ran for a while the Ilopango Air Base operation. I've talked about the trafficking out of Honduras. Now I'm going to talk about the so-called Southern Front. The Southern Front was Costa Rica. And in the same book, and this is part of the Kerry report, yes, the same skull and bonesman, John Kerry, he had a committee hearing about the CIA's efforts in Central America to oust the Sandinista regime. Continuing from the book Cocaine Politics, Drugs, Armies, and the CIA in Central America, the Southern Front. The subcommittee also explored several case studies of drug involvement by foes of the Sandinistas. Its first example focused on members of Eden Pastora's guerrilla movement in Costa Rica. A State Department report quoted by the subcommittee cited CIA information that a senior member of Eden Pastora's Sandino Revolutionary Front, FRS, agreed in late 1984 with Colombian trafficker George Morales that FRS pilots would aid in transporting narcotics in exchange for financial assistance. The FRS official agreed to use FRS operational facilities in Costa Rica and Nicaragua to facilitate transportation of narcotics. Morales agreed to provide financial support to the FRS in addition to aircraft and training for FRS pilots. After undergoing flight training, the FRS pilots were to continue to work for the FRS, but would also fly narcotics shipments from South America to sites in Costa Rica and Nicaragua for later transport to the United States. Shortly thereafter, Morales reportedly provided the FRS one C-47 aircraft and two crated helicopters. He is reported to have paid the sum of $100,000 to the FRS. A more explosive finding of the subcommittee concerned the CIA's role in this affair. Pastora's political ally, Octaviano Cesar, had informed his CIA control officer about Morales' offer and the fact that he was a drug dealer. The response, "Go ahead, as long as you don't deal in the powder." The CIA's involvement didn't stop there. After the agency dropped Pastora in the spring of 1984, it continued to fund Contra leaders who collaborated with Morales and Duran. Morales was thus fully equipped to implicate the CIA when he was finally arrested in June 1986. He offered to talk, but the U.S. Attorney in Miami and his chief drug prosecutor refused to deal. The two prosecutors impugned Morales' credibility and tried to block him from testifying before Congress. In all likelihood, those two jokers were CIA assets. Only in November 1988 did the DEA give Morales a polygraph exam and pronounce truthful his testimony about making guns for drugs deals with the Contras and the CIA. The CIA's own station chief in Costa Rica admitted that another drug suspect, American rancher John Hull, had worked with the agency on, quote, military supply and other operations on behalf of the Contras, unquote, besides receiving $10,000 monthly retainer courtesy of Oliver North. Hull, who lived in Costa Rica until 1989, told an interviewer that from 1982 to 1986, he was the CIA's chief liaison with the Nicaraguan rebels in Costa Rica. The subcommittee found no fewer than 5 witnesses who testified to Hull's involvement in the narcotics traffic, including one who personally saw cocaine being loaded in Hull's presence for air shipment to the United States. And you can read a lot about the actual operations in the book by Terry Reed, Compromised, about both George the Elder, George Bush Sr., and Bill Clinton and their involvement in narcotics trafficking. Later, in another commentary, I'll talk more about all of this, more details, because it makes for interesting reading. The role of David Kimchi, a notorious Israeli Mossad officer, Michael Harari, a Mossad officer who worked with Antonio Noriega. He was Noriega's consigliere kind of guy. Right now, I'm going to shift gears in the time I got left in the first segment and talk about what may happen in Iran. I hope it doesn't happen, but it's possible. The powers that be would like nothing better than for a U.S. aircraft carrier to be sunk. We've been pre-programmed with this. We've had books written about this very subject, novels written about U.S. aircraft carriers being sunk by the Iranians, etc., etc. So it's out there in the ether. This notion that a big American naval vessel, and in all likelihood, Ansar Allah, the Yemenis, written off with the derogatory term the Houthis, they don't call themselves that, Ansar Allah, in all likelihood, they've probably sunk at least one U.S. naval warship by now. Indeed, Donald Trump even tweeted out the fact that a U.S. warship had been sunk. And again, I don't want it to happen, but if there was ever an incident that would inflame the passions of all these mindless, brain-dead flag wavers, that would be it. I mean, think of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor, the Gulf of Tonkin, 9/11, goading and allowing the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor, Lusitania, all that rolled up in one. That's what would happen if a U.S. aircraft carrier got destroyed in that part of the world. The jingoism, the self-righteousness, very much the same kind of gung-ho mentality that prevailed after 9/11 will once again raise its ugly head. We're already seeing all these special forces, ex-special forces influencers on YouTube cheerleading another war against Iran. These guys don't know their history. They don't know what's gone on in those countries. In fact, many of the countries that they've served in, I mean, it's a joke. Some of the very people they claim to have fought and defeated, like ISIS, were aided and abetted by deep black elements of the CIA, Mossad, etc. We're going to see a replay of that in the bogus war on drugs coming up against the cartels. Some of the very same air bases, military bases that U.S. Special Forces and the Rangers, etc., will be staging out of in different parts of the very same bases. The cartels will be flying in and out drugs. That's how the game works. So getting back to Iran, Yemen, the powers that be would like nothing more than a U.S. aircraft carrier and ideally some of the escort vessels to go down. And people must remember the U.S. Navy not calling the shots. All the people in Ansar Allah have to do is be lucky once, nailing a U.S. warship underway at sea. They've already shot down a bunch of drones, but all they got to do is be lucky and outlast the Americans. This is where the lack of an understanding of history comes in. The North Vietnamese defeated the American army. And when I say the American army, I include the Marines in that. Why? Because they outlasted them. They didn't have to win any or even most of the battles in the field against the Americans. They just had to be there at the end. They just had to survive. That was their way of winning, to get to the finish line. Think of the hare and the turtle, the hare and the tortoise story. And the tortoise got there to the finish line. And that's all the Yemenis have to do. There's talk about sending U.S. Special Forces into Yemen. That's a non-starter. They're just going to get swallowed up in a vast country. Resupply will be difficult. They won't have a friendly guerrilla force they can raise. There may be some dissidents, I guess you can call them that they might stumble upon. But in the main, they're not going to be able to create a fighting force the way the Army Special Forces did in Vietnam, raising SIGIs, civilian irregular defense groups, and working with Hmong tribesmen and Chinese nuns, etc., etc. They won't have that opportunity. The Yemenis are very much united against the U.S. Navy. And remember, Yemen's war wasn't initially against the U.S. Navy. It's because the U.S. Navy insists on doing the fighting for other countries that the Yemenis are targeting them. And again, the Yemenis only have to get lucky once, whereas the U.S. Navy has to avoid having one of their capital ships sunk. And always remember, those vertical launchers on board of the U.S. naval warships, there's X number of so-called canisters beneath the deck of the warships, and each one of those canisters has one missile, and when it's launched, they have to be resupplied. And it's not a case of underway replenishment where another ship pulls alongside, they throw a line over, then they start transferring provision supplies and ammunition over. It doesn't work like that. Those U.S. warships that have expended all of their missiles out of their vertical launchers, they have to go to a port. They have to go to a port, ideally, that has the right equipment, heavy duty cranes to lift the missiles and put them into the canisters. That takes time. And if they don't have cranes, then they're going to have to do it by hand. Meanwhile, the Houthis, so called, that's a derogatory term, Ansar Allah, they have lots of weapons. They have lots of missiles, lots of drones. The U.S. is on the end of a very long supply chain. This notion of sending in special forces into Yemen in that mountainous terrain, just cut it out. That's not going to work. Some of the Yemeni command and control systems are deep underground. They, in all likelihood, also have what they call TELs, transport, erector, launch. These are mobile missile launching platforms which they can move around. It's not like in the movies where they just send a spy satellite. They can see everything in real time. They have to use drones and other forms of surveillance. Otherwise, they'd have to wait, because when they send a spy satellite out, an imagery satellite out of Vandenberg, for example, they go into polar orbit, and essentially they position the satellites in such a way that they stop it at a certain area above the Earth, and they wait for the part of the Earth they want to image has to pass beneath them, beneath the satellite. Right? It's not like in the movies where they just send a satellite here and there. They have to wait for a certain part of the Earth's surface to come into view, and they only got so much time to image it before, because of the Earth's rotation, that part of the Earth goes away, and they can't image it any longer. In real time, they're not going to be able to see everything they want, and it's gotten to the point, and we've seen this again and again, where despite the lack of actual military targets, that's not stopping the Navy. They're just blasting anything that they think looks like a military target. Could be a civilian target, doesn't matter. They're going to blast it. That's just going to inflame the passions of the Yemenis even more. Again, I remind people, and I remind the people in the military about history. The U.S. won just about every conflict, campaign, battle in the field against the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong, but I'm talking about major large-scale battles, especially the Tet Offensive. In the end, it didn't matter because the North Vietnamese outlasted the Americans. They were still standing, and that's all the Yemenis got to do. They just got to survive. They just got to continue. Whereas if U.S. aircraft carrier gets sunk, it'll be an automatic clarion call for the left to just go nuts. What we saw actually in the Tet Offensive, there was two battles going on. It was the nationwide uprising in South Vietnam, the so-called Tet Offensive, but at the same time, the American left was activated in America. So I see something like that happening again, where tensions stirring the pot, creating all this racial division and animosity in a future race war. Well, it's been ongoing, really, but it'll be official before too long. So that is in the offing. And then on top of that, you have this general uprising by the left. If the war expands any more against Yemen and against Iran, the anti-war left has been AWOL for a long time now, but because they're basically useful idiots and tools, they can be motivated to, and it doesn't take much encouragement, to go on the warpath again, so to speak, by any misstep by the Trump administration. And they're biting off way more than they can chew. Yemen is a non-starter. You cannot win a war there. And then if you can't beat the Yemenis, you're not going to beat Iran. That's definitely a non-starter. All the protest of these flag wavers notwithstanding, they just don't know their own history. Look at the demands that Trump has made against the Iranians. Not only must they give up their nuclear enrichment program, which the Iranians are using for peaceful purposes, but of course they can flip the switch and enrich the fissionable material to weapons grade if it comes to that. Not only does Trump and his minders want the Iranians to stop doing that, but get this, they're demanding the Iranians give up their missile program. Think of missiles as long-range artillery. The notion that Iran will willingly give up their missiles is a non-starter, because that's just an open invitation for Iran to get attacked and just obliterated. Netanyahu himself said he wants an outcome similar to what happened in Libya. And need I remind you what happened to Libya and to Gaddafi? He died a horrific death with Sunni jihadists shoving metal rods up his backside. Libya became overrun by Sunni jihadists, and now they have open-air slave markets selling Africans to the highest bidder. People being decapitated left, right, and center. I mean, it's a mess over there in Libya. And that's what Netanyahu wants for Iran to be overrun by Sunni jihadists. Of course, the Iranians don't want that. Why should they? So they're not going to give up their nuclear energy program. They're certainly not going to give up their missile program, because that would be tantamount to national suicide. The Iranians have a robust air defense system. The Israelis found that out. And we shouldn't forget the possibility that Russia may come in on the side of Iran if the U.S. openly, blatantly attacks Iran. Lamestream media is now reporting something I suspected, that the Yemenis were getting satellite imagery from the Chinese. It turns out there's a Chinese corporation that's been providing overhead imagery of the location of the American warships to the Yemenis. Surprise, surprise. Didn't surprise me. I figured something like that was going on. And there's a lot of saber rattling between the U.S. and China. And my 2 cents about China: the Chinese communists consider Taiwan a part of their country. That is an internal affair. There's no reason for the Americans to get involved in that. If the American fleet tries to come to the rescue of the Taiwanese, that is going to be disastrous. They're going to get hammered by a series of island chains and artificially created islands that have been fortified with anti-ship missiles. The Chinese also have their latest generation fighters, and they have submarines. So this notion that an American carrier task force and an American amphibious expeditionary unit, a MEU, Marine Expeditionary Unit, or a Marine Amphibious Ready Group. I'm using old terminology. I don't know what they call them anymore, but that's what they used to call them back in the day when I was more familiar with the subject. All those Marines will be sailing aboard what they call gator carriers, amphibious assault ships. This notion that they can just steam past all these island chains to get to Taiwan, no, that's not going to happen. They're going to get hammered. I talked about this before. The Chinese have a missile they refer to as the carrier killer, and they also have missiles that they refer to as the Guam killer. Guam is a base where nuclear weapons have been forward deployed in the past. So really, what I would like to see, and I'm sure many other people would like to see, is just throttling back and dialing down all these bombastic, bellicose statements that Trump and others in his administration, these whack jobs he's got, Hegseth, whack job, all these other people, they don't have any skin in the game. Well, they will if they get nuked. But as far as being in the front lines, no, they're not. They're politicians. Hegseth was a Fox News commentator, for crying out loud. Absolutely no qualifications for the job. Supposedly, they're going to combat the Chinese influence in Panama now. What a joke that is, when they basically gave the Panama Canal to Chinese corporations, Whampoa Huntington Limited. And for the longest time, there was a lot of confusion about how U.S. Special Forces should deal with the Chinese presence in Latin America and in Panama. Instead of relying on the Special Forces Group that specializes in Latin America, that specializes in having Spanish speaking linguists, why not bring the Special Forces Group that deals specifically with Asian affairs and has lots of intel about the Chinese? Bring them there if you're serious about countering the Chinese presence or threat in Latin America. And don't squabble, oh no, this is the turf of this Special Forces Group because Latin America is their specialty. That's who needs to tackle this. Well, how many Chinese linguists do they have? How many of their intel specialists in that Special Forces Group have a lot of real time current knowledge about the Chinese? So that's something that they've got to figure out. War against the cartels, wars against the Yemenis, prospective war with the Iranians, and by extension with the Russians and Chinese. It's a very dangerous time we're living in at the moment. Another quick point about the China-Taiwan issue. I don't mean to sound cavalier about the Taiwanese and kick them to the curb and, well, communism isn't our problem. Well, it's certainly going to be a problem for the Taiwanese. By now, I would venture to guess that a large fifth column of Chinese communist agitators, cells, provocateurs, espionage agents, etc., are embedded in Taiwanese culture. By now, I'm sure that's the case. So maybe I'm hoping there'll be a peaceful outcome between Taiwan and China. They can continue business as usual. It doesn't have to come to a bloody invasion. They can come to amicable terms. Hopefully that's the case because I don't want the Taiwanese to go communist. I want to emphasize that. And a quick point about the Iranian situation, just to update what I've been talking about, because I've been ill recently, so I haven't been able to update this commentary. But a couple of quick points about the Yemenis vis-a-vis the U.S. Navy. Trump went out and said, well, the Yemenis have capitulated. No, they didn't capitulate. The USS Harry S. Truman aircraft carrier has lost 3 FA-18s, and one of them may have been a modified FA-18 known as a Growler, electronic warfare plane, that had been shot down in a friendly fire incident, anti-airplane missile launched by the USS Gettysburg. And then 2 of their other planes, FA-18s, one of them was lost, fell off of an elevator doing a high-speed maneuver to evade many drones, missiles, whatever the case may be. And another plane came to grief in a landing operation, if I'm not mistaken, but don't quote me on that. So 3 airplanes lost from the USS Harry S. Truman, and the Navy decided to hightail it far away up the Red Sea to get away from all of this. And then Trump spins it out and says, well, the Yemenis have capitulated. No, they haven't capitulated. It's the U.S. Navy that's capitulated. Let's get that straight. I've recently had Judith Quoba back on the show, and she provided excellent geopolitical analysis about Burkina Faso. And wouldn't you know it, no sooner had Captain Ibrahim Traore, probably butchering that name, visited Moscow for the May 9th anniversary victory over Europe Day. No sooner had Captain Traore visited than, like the next day or two, suddenly Al Qaeda attacks. Al Qaeda attacks Burkina Faso. It's yet another example of the powers that be moving these jihadists around. Burkina Faso is 65% Muslim, but Traore wants the women in that country to be educated. He wants them to take part in the building up of the infrastructure of the country. He wants to keep the jihadists out because he's seen what the jihadists have done in Libya, Syria, and all these other places. And a quick comment about Syria. I alluded to it before, but people were talking about, oh, look, Trump has turned away from Bibi. Trump and Netanyahu are feuding. Well, maybe, maybe not. And then Trump goes over and in this parlay involving the Saudis and some of the Gulf Emirates, then he starts hobnobbing with Jelani, the jihadists that had been armed, supplied, financed, given intelligence, etc., moved into the rubble that used to be Syria and has taken it over. And in the process, Jelani and his forces are murdering and decapitating all these Christians, Alawites, etc., etc. This is exactly what the Sunni jihadists do everywhere they're moved into. And he's the big ally over there. The guy is literally a mutilator, decapitator, etc. And here's Trump hobnobbing with him. So, was there really a breakup with Israel? I doubt it, because if the main decapitator of Syria is being lauded and upheld as this paragon of society by the Trump administration, that falls perfectly in line with the Haaretz Israel, Greater Israel agenda. Anyhow, I just wanted to throw that out there. And thank you, dear listeners, for listening. Wherever you may be, whatever you may be doing, have a very pleasant time, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.